The road to space isn't paved with technology and rockets alone. It's built on the dreams, risk, and relentless spirit of those who dare look up and say, "We belong there." For over 30 years, the Space Frontier Foundation has been a home for these visionary, radical, action-oriented individuals. Hear their stories, learn how space was shaped, and revel in the revolution of commercial space pioneers.
Today, I get to have this conversation with a friend of mine, someone who has more stories about making our space economy what it is, even than I know. So some of the stories I'm hoping to draw out of Jeff are going to be probably new to me. And Jeff, I note the hat. Well played, sir, right out of the gate. So as I mentioned before you joined, this is to help tease out what it was actually like in this before time, the things that you and the other people did that moved us from the kind of large monolithic national space world that existed for a while to this commercial one that exists today. As much as possible, I want to hear from you about your personal journey, as well as how that intersects with this effort of making space more accessible. So you've served, been involved in the foundation, but I'm going to start way back. Do you have a framework or a moment or a thing that drew you in to care about space enough that it's more than just something that's cool?
I do, and there are a couple of defining moments in my life going back decades that have brought me to where I am. It is a torturous and twisting, turning path. 1 step forward, 18 steps sideways, 312 steps backwards, and then 2 steps forward again. And I see you shaking your head, so you understand that, as any entrepreneur would. And one of the things that I talk about when I'm asked that question is, I remember as a child, and I'm talking 8, 9, 10 years old, I remember after dinner going out into the backyard at night and laying on the lawn and just gazing up at the moon and just being fascinated, maybe even compelled. Of course, when you're that age, you don't probably even know what the word compelled means and don't really know maybe that that's what's happening. I didn't understand anything more about that other than that moon is really cool. And sometimes, of course, it's really big, depending on where it is in the sky and so forth. So, that is one of the first moments that I remember somehow connecting with what I later understood was this passion about the human exploration and settlement development of space. So that was that first little twinkling. Fast forward into college. I mean, I don't recall if I was like so many kids, I'm going to be an astronaut when I grow up. I don't remember if I had that attitude or that thought. But what I do remember is I really sucked at math. My mind just isn't wired that way. So I knew I wouldn't be an astronaut. If I was going to do something in space, it wouldn't be as an astronaut. It was toward the end of my undergraduate work that I think I started to get a little bit more like the next step of, this is an interest of mine. And of course, I had discovered Star Trek, the original series, which as far as I'm concerned is the only one that really matters, but that's another topic. So fascination with science fiction, right? So I went to graduate school at the University of Houston, which is in Clear Lake, which is the campus is adjacent to Johnson Space Center. I went there because I had heard about this incredible master's degree called Future Studies that I was fascinated by the more I learned about it. And I also went because, how cool is this? It's right next to Johnson Space Center. Maybe I can do some things that are space related with my graduate program.
So at that point, you were still that fascination from looking up at the sky carried with you into your undergraduate work. You divorced it from astronaut, but still were interested in space.
Yes, and there's no connection between that passion and my undergraduate work. My undergraduate degree is sociology and psychology. There was no connection to my interest in space. I really wasn't thinking professionally at all. That didn't really start until I discovered this future studies program. And as I said, I thought maybe I could do some projects related to space and Johnson Space Center. And I did. Some of the papers I wrote for my graduate programs, like one of them was all about the space-based solar power. Now, this is a paper I wrote after discovering the concept back in 1979, 1980. And I read a paper on, wasn't the technology, the business implications, the political, the geopolitical, I just don't remember. I know I've got the paper around here somewhere. So I started using my graduate program to learn more about space and just be involved. And I ended up, one of the projects I did was I worked with a professor at the main University of Houston campus. I can't remember his name, but he had funding from Hilton. And in fact, there was a Hilton hotel on the main campus of the University of Houston because they had a hotel management program. He was doing studies on orbiting habitats that was funded by Hilton. And so for a couple months, I worked on that work with him. I don't remember what I did.
Can you give us a rough time frame of when this might have been?
This would have been 1979, 1980.
Okay, so we're post-Apollo, pre-shuttle?
Yes. First shuttle flight was April 1981 with Krukin and Young. Space
hotels. And for folks, keep in mind, part of the audience for this discussion is people that may not have come to the Earth yet. And so, some context setting, I think, is helpful. We landed humans on the moon. We saved some people from a problem with a trip to the moon. We did a few more trips to the moon. And then it wasn't like...
But then there was Skylab, right? Remember Skylab? That was before the shuttle. So you had that manned orbiting facility for, I don't remember how long. So that was going on at that time.
And so this also, you have, what was it, Pan Am, which was, some folks may not even know that's an airline. In 2001, A Space Odyssey, there's the Pan Am shuttle.
Space Kipper, yeah.
Right, so we're crossing over. And so this space hotel study in 80, time frame is as the interest and excitement for this shuttle is ramping up. Do you have any recollection of what the expectation was around that time?
I really don't, and it's unfortunate. Okay. I don't have any notes or anything from that. I think I only worked on that project for a month or two, and as I said, I don't remember what exactly I did. I just remember being amazed that you have a company like Hilton is funding research into the future of space hotels in 1980. Like you're saying. I mean, think about the time frame, right? 1980.
Yeah, it's a few years ago.
So that was another step into how can I be involved? How can I turn my passion into some kind of activity that contributes to what I really care about so deeply? So that was another step in that direction. The next step was in this graduate program, I had a choice of writing a thesis or doing a big project or a graduate internship somewhere. I wanted to do a graduate internship. So this was in the first half of 1981. Reagan was president. There was a federal hiring freeze on for a portion of that year. So I started, remember, this is pre-personal computer, pre-internet, right? So I bought this book that's about this thick that was published by the government printing office. That was literally like a directory of every government agency in Washington, D.C., and all the little departments and sub-departments and the heads of those departments and their phone numbers. I mean, everything, addresses. So I bought that book and I just started going through everything related to space. And I wrote letters to, 50, 60 or so people that led, were leaders or, sub-leaders of these different government agencies, introducing myself, my graduate studies. I wanted to do an internship that's related to space exploration. I got letters back. I got phone calls from a lot of these people I mean, I got a lot of letters saying, sorry, we don't do anything that's space related. I got some that said we do, but we don't have an internship program. And I got phone calls from a few people that said, we don't have anything, but I just wanted to talk to you because I've never heard of someone looking to do an internship like this related to space. Ultimately, of course, NASA headquarters was one of the places I wrote to. Ultimately, there were two offers that came back that I had to choose from. And this was for me what I call one of my rocking chair moments. And I really need to think and make a decision and be quiet and sit in a rocking chair. I had an offer to do an internship at the International Affairs Division at NASA headquarters. I also had an offer that touched on another interest of mine, which is still strong today, which is geopolitics and foreign policy. I had an offer to work in the UN office of the United States Assistant Undersecretary for UN Affairs, right? And this is a really difficult choice. But ultimately, it was like, Jeff, who are you kidding? You got to do the one at NASA. The other one has nothing to do with space, as fascinating as it would be. So that was my next big step. And I got to, for 6 months, be a part of the International Affairs Division at NASA headquarters, attending all the meetings, helping compile information. And so that was another step up and another step forward in learning more, contributing in a very small way. And so I did that for 6 months, finished my graduate studies in May of 1981. And then it was like, okay, time to find a job. Well, there was a federal hiring freeze in Washington. Sean, I went and interviewed at a whole bunch of different federal agencies that did work related to space, including I got interviewed by at the CIA, the director of the program that monitored the Soviet space program. There were, a variety of agencies I interviewed with. Again, none of them could hire me, but they still wanted to interview me because they assumed at some point, if they were interested, they would be able to hire me. But I couldn't wait around. So I went back to Houston, and my girlfriend at the time said, you should go interview with IBM. They're hiring like crazy. You can interview as a systems engineer or a sales rep. They'll train you. They have a big team at Johnson Space Center. Maybe you can get on that team. I was like, oh, that's a good idea. So I went and interviewed, got hired as a systems engineer, and made it very clear as soon as there's an opening on IBM's NASA team at Johnson Space Center, that's where I want to be. And about 6 months after I was hired, and I was still a trainee, I was assigned to the NASA team at Johnson Space Center. So this is late 1981. And I was like, oh my God, this is great. I'm finally working and doing something professionally related to my love of space exploration. And I stayed on the NASA team for about 4.5 years. So the early years of the space shuttle program. And this marked a real turning point for me because after 4.5 years, I had become thoroughly disenchanted and disgusted with NASA because working on the inside, I was learning and seeing and experiencing this was not the same NASA that had taken us to the moon. It had become a risk-averse, sclerotic, bureaucratic agency, and I couldn't stand to be a part of it after 4.5 years because I couldn't fix it. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that different girlfriend, that I literally was in tears when I was talking with her and realized I can't do this anymore. I can't be a part of this. What am I going to do? I need to do something related to space, but I can't do this. And as I said, Sean, no exaggeration, I was in tears over this. That's how emotionally traumatic that realization was for me. So I stayed in IT for several decades, sometimes doing aerospace related stuff, not always. But that marked a turning point for me, which then brought opportunities to start to learn about the Space Frontier Foundation.
You are not alone in that disillusionment. You're not alone from your contemporaries, and you're not even alone. There are people now that have that juxtaposition of enthusiasm and understanding of what's underneath the hood. So Did you have any sense when you were doing this internship? Did you have any sense of that, or did you come out of that graduate internship still filled with hope?
I did, but that's a great question, because one very strong memory that I have during that internship was being in a meeting with the entire International Affairs Division team, which was a dozen or so people. I could still picture some of these people, the ones I worked with on a daily basis. And one of the discussions was, had just learned that Congress was canceling funding for some unmanned, robotic mission. I don't remember which one it was. And as the international affairs team, it was the responsibility to convey that information to whatever international partners were involved. And I remember being so upset and speaking up in the meeting. I was not, they didn't say, Jeff, you just sit in the back corner. I'm at the table with everyone else. It was a wonderful experience. And I spoke up, and to the effect of what the hell is the matter with those people? Don't they understand how important this is? And, I had my say. And the director of that division, he was wonderful. He said, we all feel the same way that you do. We understand what you're saying. We understand how you feel, but that's the reality of dealing with Congress, and that's how decisions are made. And, all we can do is go forward and do what we need to do. It was really, that's really the strong, that's probably the strongest memory I have of those 4 or 5 months in that office, because of how I reacted to it emotionally.
How has your casting of, I can cheat a little bit because I know some of the things that happen later, but as you think back on that, how has that experience changed as your involvement in the industry has changed? Like, do you think now that was a good thing to have done, or would you counsel something different? Or
you mean, was the internship a good thing to have done? Is that what you're asking?
Your emotional reaction
to
that, like,
I don't know, how would you say if it was good or bad? It was real, it was in the moment, it was what it was. Okay. I would say I'm glad that I felt strongly enough to want to speak up and say something in a place where, as welcome as I was and treated as a member of the team, that in my own mind, I'm sure there was a part of me going, who the hell am I? I'm just an intern here. What views, what weight do my views carry? So I'm not sure if that's the answer, any answer you were looking for.
Some degree of this comes from your surprise at another system that exists over top of what was the entirety of the space world at the time, right? The idea that you don't really think of rockets and congressional hearing. Maybe some people immediately do, but space seems to be very far away from boring politics, except for the fact that it's not. And it sounds like that was probably the first shock to the system of...
It was probably, along with that shock to the system, probably the first awareness, even though here I am at NASA, a government agency funded by Congress, but I wasn't thinking about that. So that's a good context that you bring up, Sean. It probably was the first time I was forced to kind of go, oh, this really is fundamentally a political process and a political endeavor, or at least there's that underlying texture or foundation of it. And it probably was the first time I was confronted with that and forced to understand that it isn't NASA that's making the decisions here, except for the ones they do make, but the point I'm making. I should say it differently. NASA is not in control of its destiny, just like every other part of the executive branch. It is not, because if you don't get funding, you don't exist. Yeah. I probably never thought about that in my life, space or otherwise, until that meeting. And
that is an important thing. And I think the echoes show up as your involvement in this industry continues. But that realization is still a difficult thing for people to grasp. And I did not understand the space. I didn't understand how space stuff worked until I was in the industry. And I'm an accidental guy. I did not come into this because I was enamored with space. Thought it was cool. Who doesn't? But I came in with a different sort of framework. So for a long time, I thought I was the one, like everyone else knew these things and it was all part of the training. Well, it turns out they don't necessarily include some of the politics in the classwork, right? So there's a lot of realization and then being able to process that in a way. So you had that realization, you then still wanted to work with NASA, right? So you,
Yes,
yeah,
that's correct.
from the
That did not
internship,
turn- right.
yeah. So you were like, wow, Congress is terrible. I want to go work. And so you went and worked, and then there was this other set of revelations that comes to you. So you get knocked from one side, and then you get knocked from the other. And why weren't you just like, oh, okay, sure, this is the way the world works. I need to be part of the system.
Yeah, why didn't I just pack up my bags and go home, kind of thing?
But no. Why fight City Hall? Like when you realized from your time working at IBM with NASA, and you saw this risk aversion, you saw the bureaucracy, you saw what by the 80s our national space program had become, and it dawned on you, as you said, that this isn't Mercury and Apollo, right? I mean, we still celebrate that risk-taking, right stuff sort of thing, and you realize that that wasn't what NASA was by the time you were working. So was it, and it was obviously painful, so let me just like stick my finger more into the wound, but because this is a great insight, and when you were looking at that, did you consider one of your options as just bury my idealism and be part of the Borg? I mean, we didn't have the word Borg back then, but like,
No, yeah, I understand the question you're asking. You know, we're talking decades ago, so I can't remember everything I was thinking. I mean, one example of how profound this is, I wrote half dozen or so op-eds that were published in the Houston Chronicle that were all space related. I'm looking at the first one on my wall was published in '92. I don't remember when the others were published, but one of them was entitled The End of a Love Affair, which was my reflecting on the experience I was just describing at NASA. So I'm sure, Sean, that for a time I was like a fish out of water, no air, gills flapping, struggling to breathe, tail flapping and struggling to move, and still working as a systems engineer at IBM, but now working with health and higher education. And because I wanted to still work on a team that was doing what I thought was meaningful and socially useful work. But okay, Jeff, now what? What the hell do you do with yourself? It was NASA. Now it isn't NASA. There's nothing else as far as I know. So I left the NASA team in late '85. What the hell do I do? And I don't know what I did, if anything, that was space related for the next couple of years, because my next recollection of doing something space related, which is how I met Jim Muncie, would have been in 1988 or 1989, which was the next step that carried me forward, and a huge step. But between late '85, when I left the NASA team, and that, I don't know.
But you still cared enough to pen an op-ed about, well, I mean, again,
so
some
years later,
you have this realization, and different people will hit that at different times. It was obviously a painful realization, but it doesn't sound like you gave up on NASA organization. Did you put space out of your mind entirely?
No, I was going to say, I didn't lose my love affair with space. I lost my love affair with NASA. So, for several years, I probably just drank from the bottle of science fiction, and just whatever science fiction, space science fiction, TV and movies and reading and such. But otherwise, there was nothing I knew to do. I didn't know what other avenues I had to participate, to contribute until this 1988, 1989 event.
Okay, so this is great. You've set us up beautifully, because in the meantime, there are these other organizations. There's the L5 Society, there's National Space Institute, there are these various organizations that are taking on some of this responsibility for articulating a citizen view and multiple different views of what space may become.
Yep.
And were those organizations on your radar before this, or?
Yeah, yes, not L5. I thank you, because you reminded me of something I had not thought about in a very long time. So the National Space Institute, right before it merged with L5 to become the National Space Society. Well, I was still in graduate school, 1979, 1980. I don't remember how this came about. I was not involved with it, but some organization brought, her name was Linda Skapars. She was the executive director of the National Space Institute, 79 or 80. She came to speak at the university. You know, I went to that, met her, talked with her afterward. Later that year, maybe 1980, I think I wrote my first space article that was published in the National Space Institute's monthly magazine. It was an article about the space shuttle as a tool of U.S. foreign policy. Do you know Leonard David?
Yes.
Leonard David at that time was the editor of that magazine at the National Space Institute. So that's when I first met Leonard. I became a member of the National Space Institute and stayed a member for many years after it became the National Space Society. I probably ended that membership sometime in the early 90s, after I got involved with the Space Frontier Foundation and began to see a divergence in those two organizations in terms of what they supported.
They're not straight lines for individuals or for organizations, and rockets don't go in straight lines, which I didn't figure out until after I got into the industry. Like, isn't it just going higher? I thought higher. Anyway, your membership and involvement in NSI, NSS, those sorts of things, how involved were you? Was it like you were showing up at a social event once in a while, or you just get a newsletter? Or what was, if you can recall, like, was there a sense of community, or was it a?
There was, and again, great questions, because they're uncovering memories that I haven't thought about in a very long time. Once NSI and L5 became the National Space Society, there were some people in Houston that formed a Houston chapter of the National Space Society. There was a gentleman named Jim Davidson. I think he was front and center at making that happen. So I got involved with that chapter of the National Space Society. I went to conferences, and for a couple of years, going into the early 90s, because this gave me an opportunity to go to the second launch of the Delta Clipper in September 93 with the journalist credentials. So in the early 90s, I was a syndicated columnist. I had a monthly column called Think About It that was published in 3 or 4 NSS chapter newsletters around the country. So that was how I stayed involved at that stage, how I felt like I was contributing, which is basically communicating whatever I thought was important at the time. That helped fill something in me, the need to be part of it, the need to contribute, and hope that I was contributing in some meaningful way.
Were the other members of the local chapter, like, were these other people that were they disillusioned space people? Were they aspirational space people? Were they crazy space people?
I mean, probably all of the above, but I would say definitely aspirational. And I have to believe now, Sean, it is that group of people that brought me to the next step, how I met Jim Muncy. I can't think of any other way that this would have come about. There was an initiative to raise funds for what would have been the first commercial lunar probe. It was going to be called Lunar Prospector. And the Houston Space Society was working to raise money. I mean, literally like cold calling people and, you know, would you make a donation? And I got involved with that. And at some point, probably Jim Davidson made this happen, got Jim Muncy to come into town. This is probably within a year or so of the formation of the Space Frontier Foundation by Jim and Bob Werb and Rick Tumlinson. So Jim came into town to speak to this group of people trying to raise money. I didn't know Jim, but I volunteered to go pick him up at the airport. That's how I met Jim. That's when I learned of the Space Frontier Foundation, and that led to greater and greater involvement in subsequent years. And that was a really next big step, because that was when I first started to hear about, you mean there's another way to do space that's not government? You mean there's like entrepreneurs, there's business and commercial, totally, pardon the pun, alien concept to me at that time. And
You're a well-educated, you've worked at IBM, you've worked in a large organization, you know that our society is built on, a commercial basis, and the thought of space being a commercial thing hadn't occurred until Jim mentioned it, or like
it occurrence, I should say, or exposure was, okay, here's a group of people trying to raise private funding for a privately funded space mission, Lunar Prospector. But I don't know that I still in my mind connected, well, okay, sure, we'll raise money, but then I guess we'll just give it to NASA and they'll, do it. I don't think I had yet crossed that Rubicon of, oh, you mean there might be a company? I don't know that I had been exposed to that concept yet.
Okay.
But it definitely started to happen when Jim Muncie came and talked to the whole group of people doing this, because that's what the Space Frontier Foundation was all about. So that would have been my first real exposure and focused exposure and ongoing exposure and introduction to what we now call new space, right?
Not to give too much away, you get drawn in. You're not just, oh, that's cool. You're drawn in, and we're going to get to that part here in just a second. But did, as much as you can recall, that disillusionment that happened, was this an antidote to that, or was it just like, was it an immediate thing, or was it something that built as you thought more about it over time?
It was immediate. Well, it was definitely an antidote. It was an emotional antidote, because it was like, I've been saved. I now have a way to do something meaningful, because I can't do it at NASA anymore. So it was definitely, it was a reinvigorating experience. I absolutely bought into this whole idea. Well, why not? I don't think I had an attitude, because why would I have stayed involved? I don't think I had an attitude of, well, this is crazy. No one's done it before. I imagine my attitude was like, wow, what an amazing idea. Hell yes, I'm all in. I'll make cold calls. I mean, somebody produced these lists of, people and their phone numbers that they probably got out of a phone book. Remember phone books that had people's phone numbers, and we would just cold call. This was Houston, right? A lot of people in Houston, they got it. NASA space program. I imagine, I don't know how much money we raised. It was never enough, to get this going. And I don't know what happened to the money, but it was definitely an awakening for me in terms of, as I said, wow, commercial space, business space, entrepreneur space. And it meant a great deal. If that hadn't happened or something like that, I don't think I'd be doing what I'm doing now. And everything I've done since then that has brought me to this point. The Space Frontier Foundation was a monumental discovery for me. Picking up Jim Muncie at the airport and having a chance to just sit in the car as I was driving him to this meeting for a half an hour or so, and just everything I learned in that conversation, before I had to share it with everybody else. That was a seismic occurrence for me.
All right. So, I happen to know you mentioned DCX. Tell me about DCX. Actually, you got to go and watch. You were present.
Yeah.
What was DCX for those who maybe don't know?
So this would have been in the early 90s. And by the way, you want to have someone on here, get Jess Spawnable. He's
coming up. Yeah.
Great. So he can tell you.
Just put in an ad for coming soon.
He can tell you more about DCX. So DCX is the Delta Clipper experimental. It was funded by NASA, and then at some point, I think DoD picked up the funding when NASA stopped funding it. It was an attempt to do what Elon Musk now has done on a regular basis, which was reusable launch vehicles, but also the goal of single stage to orbit, SSTO, right? And this was sort of a gumdrop shaped experimental vehicle. I forget how many flights it had out of New Mexico near White Sands Missile Range. Again, because I've been writing these articles, I was able to get journalist credentials from the SSTO office. I still have my Delta Clipper t-shirt. I still have my Delta Clipper coffee mug. I still have my journalism pass, the picture of how I looked back then, and the little SSTO lapel pin. I have all that stuff. I got to go and watch this launch from a couple of miles away and see one of the most phenomenal things I have never seen in my life, or since then, which is a spacecraft taking off vertically, going up however many hundreds of feet or whatever, and then stopping and hovering and then moving sideways and then land vertically. That had never happened before.
It was a NASA program, though, right? This is the same NASA that you could not stand. So,
good point.
What was different?
I wonder if I thought about it back then.
Sorry, didn't mean to ruin it for you.
No, that's a question for Jess Spinable, right? Why was that funded? What part of NASA was responsible? I mean, Pete Conrad led the program.
Why did you react differently to DCX than you had to your other exposure?
Sure. It was a purely emotional thing. Well, I should say purely, it was heavily emotional, but it was also, okay, what was I doing at Johnson Space Center? I was working on the shuttle program. It didn't take long to get bored with the shuttle program. As cool as I thought it was, and still, even looking back, it was an amazing accomplishment. For all its flaws and fragility, it's an amazing vehicle, and evidence, as with so many other vehicles, you can't build one thing and expect it to do everything well. But here was something that was attempting single stage to orbit, which I'd never heard of before. So I was like, oh man, that's cool. I'm not an engineer, right? So I'm not sitting there thinking about it from a perspective of, engineering challenges and all the different, things you need to do to make it happen. I'm just like, wow, that's really cool. And I get to go and watch this. Now, I also got to be at NASA headquarters in April 1981 in the auditorium with hundreds of other NASA employees watching that first space shuttle launch, Columbia. That was really cool. It was the first one.
Right.
That was very cool. And I'm sure if Delta Clipper continued for years and years and years, it would have become less cool, just like SpaceX launches are routine. What's really cool now is watching two boosters land near each other. That's more cool than watching a rocket take off, So
Amen.
That was just to be a part of that, to be there to witness it. I shouldn't say a part of it. I wasn't a part of it. Just was a phenomenal part of it. But to be there, and then because I had journalism credentials with others, when it landed, I was able to, with all these other folks, just walk right up to the vehicle, check it out, walk around, look at all the burnt scarring on it and everything, and like, wow, this is a spaceship, so to speak. And it's like I could touch it. I have pictures of me doing all that, and, really
and
cool.
The big rocket companies, both names you know and don't know today, draw their heritage from that. So I think your experience with it and how it presented is important, because at this point, for most of us that have come along after, they all kind of get lumped together, and there are really different stages, and these movements had different impact on people. You continue to be involved at some level, but at some point you decide that first kick in the shins of Congress making a decision, you come around and start ProSpace and we have to rename March Storm because when I add those words together anymore, but March Storm and can you tell me a little bit about how we went from disillusioned to hopeful to come all the way back and take on the challenge that the younger you was so dissatisfied with?
Wow, there's a question. So
maybe it was just natural.
Looking back, you could say that, but I don't know. Does that mean it was fate or destiny? I don't know. But as I got more involved with the Space Frontier Foundation, helping with conferences and then eventually running a few conferences and becoming the first director of advocates and meeting so many other like-minded and I would say like-hearted people that shared the passion. One of the folks I met was Charles Miller, who I think he founded ProSpace. I believe it was Charles on his own. If I'm missing someone, I apologize. I got involved with ProSpace for like 10 years. Every March would go up and, do this 2 or 3 years in a row. I ran the March Storm. Worked with great folks like Tony DeTora, who I imagine you know. 2 people who I haven't been in touch with for many years, Mark Schlather and Rand Simberg. They didn't work in space professionally, but it was a passion for them, like for so many others that were involved. So yes, I think part of it was, Sean, was meeting other people and being exposed to and enveloped in their enthusiasm and their passion not reignited, at least helped me realize there is another path. There is something else to fight for, to work toward, and another way for me to contribute. And I never thought about like, oh, well, God, what are the odds of having this legislation passed or that legislation passed? And hey, I did this for 10 years. Did I make a difference? I know I made a difference in the lives of some of the younger people I've met because they've told me that many years later. And some of them are doing important jobs in this new space industry now. That in and of itself made it worthwhile to have contributed that way. Tony DeTora once told me, by leading ProSpace, he contributed to the passage of the Commercial Space Launch Amendment Act in 2004. Okay, I never thought about that. If I did, great. I played a role that's so small you can't even measure it with, an electron microscope. But
yes and no. Hold on. This is one of the beautiful and terrible things about our representative democracy. You might need billions of dollars in K Street lobbyists to get your thing in. But when you're a citizen that is carrying in something that is not strictly self-serving.
Right. It made a difference with a lot of the staffers that we met. And they took that message to their bosses, their chief of staff or that senator or that representative. And you got to remember what the giggle factor would have been like back then, too, with what we were talking about.
Tony was a staffer, and he was
on one of the subcommittees. It might have been the House.
Yeah. And he was working. I know he worked for Rohrabacher. He may have worked Dana Rohrabacher. He may have worked for someone else before that. But here's an important piece out of that. You're saying that work that you did and the relationships that you built, advocating for space. At least you got the staffer saying, "Hey, that made a difference," and I don't doubt that. There's always some fluff involved, but individual citizens absolutely can ask for things. And if it resonates well, the words you say may come out of someone else's mouth on the floor of Congress. And you're like, whoa, did I do that? I mean, it will absolutely not happen if you don't do it, right? If you don't go and
let me give an example of that. I wrote op-eds in Space News for many years. And many years ago at a conference, I met someone from NASA headquarters, passed away a couple of years ago. I introduced myself to him and he goes, I have been wanting to meet you because I used some language from one of your op-eds in one of my presentations at NASA headquarters, trying to get the old guard to understand that things were changing. And I was like, holy shit. Like, I mean, on the one hand, that's a little thing, but to me, who was like, wow, doing whatever I can do to make a difference, I felt like, wow, I made some little difference there because somebody, a manager at NASA headquarters, read what I wrote, took that, he later sent me his presentation. And so I'm really blessed, Sean, because a lot of my decades of involvement have had little moments like that, which make me feel like I made a little difference here, I made a little difference there. And that is so important because in the big picture, we're not all Elon Musk and we're not all, Jeff Bezos, but that doesn't mean that all the people doing the things that you and I and all the others that I've mentioned and Michael aren't important and aren't making a difference, maybe in ways that we will never know. Yeah. But we're all part of that push out into the solar system.
And I'm going to imagine that you did not have a specific objective of getting your language into a presentation and
No.
had a plan to get there, right?
No, I mean, one of the things I have learned about myself over the decades, and this is just not relevant to what I do space-wise, is I have a need to communicate what I think and what I feel. And that has been one of the things I learned and polished as a systems engineer, which was a technical sales position, essentially, working with salespeople. So all that training and subsequent training and other jobs. But in essence, I have felt a need to communicate what I believe is important, whether it was space or otherwise. And no, you're right. It's not like I had this master plan, like I'll write this and this person will read it. It's just like, I have to do this. I have to write. I have to go speak. I have to do March Storm. I just have to do it.
And some people think of the world as deterministic, right? Series of events that leads to a thing. And the old adage about marketing is only half of marketing works. You just don't know which half.
Don't know which half.
Right. And so it's a similar sort of thing in the investment that you were making, not because it was going to lead to an immediate payoff, but because it was the thing that lined up with what you believed. And one of those things bore fruit.
I mean, to me, this is an example of why I feel there's entrepreneurs and then there are space entrepreneurs. And so what do I mean by that? To be an entrepreneur, to some extent, you have to be driven. Right? There's not always a rational reason that you go out and start a company against all odds. You're compelled. You're driven. There's something in your soul, your heart, your DNA, however you want to say it. But you are driven to do this. And then you have space entrepreneurs that have a whole nother level of what's driving them that I think exists on top of that entrepreneurial layer. There's that space layer. And for me, when did I experience it first? When I was compelled to go out in the backyard and lie on the lawn at night and look at the moon and not really have any understanding of what is that all about, other than, wow, that's really cool. And it turned out to be, it was about a lot more. I think one of the best ways to know that you're an entrepreneur, deep inside, space or otherwise, is when someone says, well, why do you do this? And your answer is, I don't know. What that says to me is you don't have a rational reason. You're just compelled to do it. And I think that applies to so many of us in this space community. You know?
Yeah. Yes. I don't want to cast myself into your story. I have a tangential related thing to that space love, but it is the thing that even when dealing with that disillusionment, when dealing with the, oh crap, this isn't quite, my childhood innocence is being destroyed by understanding how this actually works, to then be able to still find something to hold on to. And you had a big gap there where there wasn't something to hold on to. But then since then, it sounds like that has, I don't think NASA has completely changed, right? It's not like that view of NASA that you had in the early 80s. Is that gone? I mean,
no, that part of it lives in the Space Launch System, right? And all the congressional interference with that. But yeah, there are certainly elements of NASA going back 15 years or so that get it. Pete Warden is a perfect example back when he was the director of Ames Research Center, right? And he, for 2 years, he provided, $125,000 of funding for the early years in the New Space Business Plan competition that Tom Olson, Michael Lane, and for many years, Megan Crawford and myself, ran that at the space portal at Ames. Pete Warden got it. And there were others in NASA that are have since then been kind of pushing and cajoling. And so I think NASA's changed a lot, yes, but you still have the congressional aspect of it that will never change, in my opinion, and that NASA cannot control its own destiny.
So thanks for letting me drag you through some of this history. What we leave out of this conversation is all the cool things, the space things that you did after, and your time as executive director of the Space Frontier Foundation. We might pick up another piece of that story later, but I really appreciate your kind of sharing what life was like and what space was like through that time, and the actions that you and others took that made the world that we get to play in today exist. Because if not for those actions, if not for the advocacy, if not for the disillusionment, if not for the, hey, maybe we can have a commercial approach to this, if those things had not happened, this conversation wouldn't be happening. And we, so much of the value of space that's already been unlocked wouldn't be here. Do you have any, prognostication? Telling the future is always hard, especially because it's in the future, or whatever. There's some Yogi Berra thing that I'm butchering,
Yeah,
but like,
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Recommendations, thoughts for folks who might be watching this and like, holy crap, I never knew those things. What do we do next?
There's a lot of ways to answer that question. Now, I want to start with, and I'm pointing at you who's watching this, and thank you for watching this. If anything I've said in terms of what's in here and what it takes to be an entrepreneur, and even more than that, or in addition to that, that passion that I experienced as a child that I didn't even really understand what that meant. If you have the slightest sense that that exists in you, nurture it and explore it and figure out how to have that guide you, but don't expect it to be on a straight path. One of my favorite quotes is a Spanish poet. The quote, and this so applies to my journey, is, "Wanderer, there is no path. You lay a path in the walking." I could never have predicted that I'd be doing what I'm doing today, or that when I was studying sociology and psychology as an undergraduate, that I'd end up being an IBM systems engineer at Johnson Space Center. So what made those things happen? Something inside of me that pulled me, pushed me, compelled me, that never died. Maybe it slept for a while, because I got so frustrated and disenchanted. But there were definitely times in my life. I'm a firm believer in the concept of synchronicity. Once you're clear on why you're here and what your purpose in life is and what you want to do, if you live that, you will meet people along the way that will further you along. Things will happen. I believe that because I've experienced it. And a perfect example is when I decided in around 2004 to put my IT career aside and start to create a speaking, writing, and consulting business around space. I had no idea how to do that. I had no idea how challenging and frustrating and rewarding and anxiety producing that would be. I'd never been an entrepreneur. And what was one of the first things that happened? I very quickly got 2 consulting engagements. And then I got a call from Bob Werb in late 2004, because Bob and Jim and Rick and others, Charles, they knew me because of all the things I'd done as an advocate. And Bob calls me out of the blue and says, "We have money, we can hire an executive director full time, and we would like that to be you." I wasn't looking for that. I've never done anything like that. And I said, "Oh, I need to think about this." And I thought about it for 24 hours. And ultimately what I came down with is, go where I'm being asked to do something that fits what I love. And I'll just have to make it up as I go along and make my mistakes and learn along the way. It was a great experience for 3 years. And that opened up a lot of new relationships and new opportunities. And so to me, that's a perfect example of synchronicity working. So just be open to what's going on inside of you, if you've got that space bug.
Yeah, I love being open, putting yourself in a place where opportunities can find you, right? I mean, that's synchronicity, the alignment of timing of things that you can't plan it.
So, can't plan it.
Jeff, thank you so much for
thank you.
all of the work over all of the decades, and for another hour of your time now. And we will definitely be continuing to talk to Congress and follow the path that you had laid out for us here at the foundation. So thank you very much. We'll hopefully talk to you soon.
Enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to this conversation with Jeff. It went a whole bunch of different directions I wasn't really anticipating, but I did figure out, I can clarify now, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. That was the quote I was trying to get to and didn't quite. But
got it now. Michael, what do you think of it?
You know, I've known Jeff for about 8 years. I'm on the board with him for the Center for Space Commerce and Finance, so I've gotten to know him from that perspective, and I was a part of the early pro space March Storm days back in 2004 and 5, I think. So I've been watching this guy from the edges for a long time, and then over the last maybe 3 or 4 years, I've really been fortunate to get to know him, on a personal level, and to see his just ongoing multi-decade story as he unfolded it for us, but then for me to see it on sometimes a week by week basis when we'd have meetings and stuff, to see it was surprising. One thing that was surprising to me was his story about how he kind of lost faith for a little while, got angry at the situation, got angry at NASA, got angry in the decisions he'd made. And then the arc of, that space bug, when it bites you, there isn't really a cure, right? You come back to it one way or another or another or another or another. So it's perseverance, it's grit, it's determination. Yeah, I just really admire that. Yeah.
And it's okay to experience those things. And that's, I think, one of the messages that like you and I got out of that conversation, and that hopefully others do as well. Like, you can't always be sunshine and rainbow in the face of reality. And so, he had to deal with reality. But he didn't abandon all hope. So,
right. How easy would it have been to just throw your hands up and walk away, right? Like that would have been the easy choice, but then to just keep coming back. Yeah. And,
just because some of the things that Jeff was dealing with, some of them have been resolved, but there's still going to be that sort of challenge. The ones that I experienced are a little different than the ones that he did, but I still have those, gut-wrenching, can I keep doing this where the world doesn't seem to be, like, the world is out of resonance with itself. And yet, if you can stick through it, you might be able to pull it out. So
I'm going to post a comment from one of the Space Frontier Foundation advocates, that disillusionment shows up in most of us from back then. Yeah, Al, without doing any spoiler alerts, we've now done, Sean being on camera, has now done, I think, 10 interviews, and we have seen that as the most compelling arc over and over and over again. And yet they still keep doing it. Yeah. It's pretty remarkable.
And honestly, it's one of those things about human nature. We tend to think that everybody else is fine. And it's even amplified now by the social media effect. But when we experience setbacks, when we experience loss, we tend to think that we're different and that we're alone in that loss, in that pain. Because people don't usually run around talking about all the terrible thing. Like, okay, there's maybe you got one friend who just complains all the time. But I mean, other than that, like, you don't know how many people have gone through some really painful things. And, the same thing applies here to the people in the space industry. And I think it's therapeutic to talk about those things and to acknowledge them, and for other folks to realize that, you may encounter the same things. So
Yeah. What were some moments? What were some moments that you saw your own story in his story?
the realization that he got, so I came into the industry from a very different angle, but some of the world making a little bit more sense when it is placed into the context that the foundation stands for, like the commercial, the free enterprise being essential to opening up space. I think that's really an important point. Like, I knew it and I was born into it, but that that and the life changing event that is meeting Jim Muncie for the first time. But that's well, it's true for all of us in some way.
This would be a good time for a commercial for, why are we doing this series? Like, why does this matter? What is this series for?
This matters for a couple of reasons. Number one, the stories themselves are great, and the people who are telling them this is a different way to look at the work that they have done, and maybe they haven't been invited to frame their stories in the way that this is doing. So that, number one, is great. But number two, we can see themes from these conversations. And if we can draw the line from the themes that these individuals have talked about and gone through, that same lens, that same theme or set of themes can apply to people today. So we've got some gray hairs here. They were not gray hairs when they were going through this. And so, I don't want people to misunderstand and think, oh, well, it's the gray hairs that did all these great things. No, it wasn't. They have become gray over the years. And so, we want to make sure that we are looking for ways to embody the same sort of themes. And then the third piece is to understand how this activity that went on, that is pro-social and had a free market commercial drive, but didn't necessarily create wealth in the immediate term. It's part of that working for this larger good. And the world that we have today exists only because of the work that they did to change the systems.
Right.
Because if the systems hadn't changed, we wouldn't have these and they wouldn't exist. They wouldn't have a legal framework to exist.
Right.
And that's one of the things that I'm still learning exactly how deep that well is.
Sean, all that is true, but it's really important that I interrupt you and tell people that the job isn't done yet. Right. The work isn't finished yet. There needs to be replacements for people like you and me and Jeff and all the other people that we've interviewed and will continue to interview. This program came about because it's the 35th anniversary of the Space Frontier Foundation, right? So, there's a retrospective element here, but the point of doing this is to look into the future. And this needs to be an invitation to those other folks out there and say squarely, that work that those early pioneers did, it took 3.5 decades to accomplish it. But there's a lot more to do, and we're starting to look at the 3.5 decades in the future, right? So,
exactly.
So the gray hairs have their role. As you said, we weren't gray haired then, but we also need our replacements to join now, so that 35 years from now, we get to do these interviews talking about. Yeah,
I look forward to that, and I will have all kinds of
we've got stories.
stories to tell. Yeah.
Right on.
Well, we are going to
what's
take.
up next? Oh,
So
sorry.
the series is going to take a week off, and then we'll pick up again 2 weeks from now with Charles Miller, who was one of the people that Jeff was referring to directly. So, yeah, feel free to come back and check out the next couple pieces. And there's still a lot more phenomenal stories,
Yeah.
and phenomenal lessons to come.
We've got. Can I tell people who
Please.
we've already got in the can in our editing, or is
Sure.
that still state secrets? Okay. So far, we've had interviews with Sam Caniglio. We've got Jeff Sponable, who was mentioned directly in this last interview. Gary Olison's going to have some edits to his, and that's going to come up. Rick Tomlinson is in there, of course. Munsey's in there, of course. Who else we got? Jeffrey Mamber. That was a fascinating one. I'm not going to say I'm picking favorites, but I learned maybe the most that I have learned out of this. All of these stories have been new to me, even though I've been in this business for 20 years. All of these stories have been new to me, but Mamber was one that I really wish I knew when it was happening, because I think I would have liked to have been involved with that. And then Charles Miller. So some great people.
Gary Hudson. Yeah. I mean, there's still, and you may know a lot of these names. That's the thing. I know the names and I know the people, and commit to blah, blah, blah. But like, I haven't taken the time to sit down. And it's a weird thing. It's not like you're just going to sit down at a conference and say, "Hey, so tell me about
your story." Right.
We get in this, we get to go a little bit deeper than you might otherwise. And so I hope everyone else gets to get the same value that I'm getting out of these conversations.
Okay. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Next Tuesday, if you're on the Liftport channel, we've got youtube.com/Liftport. We've got the Red Planet Live show from the Mars Society. So we're alternating Space Frontier Foundation and Mars Society. Okay, we'll be back on the 22nd. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Sean.
Thanks, everybody.